Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, distinguished representatives from civil society organizations and fellow board members to this 2021 NGO dialogue connected with the 131st session of the International Narcotics Control Board. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to the Vienna NGO Committee on Drugs for helping to plan and organize this fourth INCB dialogue with civil society. These dialogues have really become a standing item on the agenda of our May session, and they reflect our recognition of the board of the valuable role played by NGOs towards the achievement of the aims set out in the 3 drug control conventions. As for our previous meetings with civil society, we have selected the topic today to align with the planned thematic chapter of our chapter 1 of our annual report. And for 2021, this will be on the illicit financial flows associated with drug trafficking and the impact of these flows on development of security. The board is very concerned about the enormous flows of money in the illicit drugs market and the effects that it has in undermining our societies on their development and security. We're also concerned that for many years, law enforcement activities have more focused on the small drug dealers and users and some middlemen, while the ones that are steering the networks remain out of reach of these law enforcement activities. The board needs to be able to respond to ever-changing trends in manufacture, trafficking, and abuse of narcotic drugs and psychoactive substances and their precursors. The global landscape for trafficking in dangerous substances has changed significantly over the 3 decades since the adoption of the UN Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances of 1988. In addition to the traditional trafficking methods and routes, in this area of growing communication and globalized trade, it has become particularly profitable for drug traffickers to make use of the internet, to market their products, and also to make use of the ever-growing logistics services to deliver their products to the customers' doorsteps. Addressing illicit financial flows is a crucial tool in addressing and countering this development. And therein, public-private partnerships are essential. In this, the board's GRIS Program, that stands for Global Rapid Interdiction of Dangerous Substances, and other operational projects of the boards, have set the promotion of public-private partnerships among their priorities. To achieve this, the board is focusing on the 4 M's, which are the key areas used by drug traffickers. And they stand for manufacture, marketing, movement, and monetization. The GRIS program has been successful in promoting relevant partnerships in the first 3 M's, the manufacture, marketing, and movement, as exemplified by a series of meetings to promote networking and practical discussions among experts from governments and relevant industries. GRIS held a stakeholders meeting, a stakeholders consultation on the trafficking of dangerous substances through exploitation of e-wallet services in the period of the 22nd of February and the 5th of March of this year. So we have now activated the promotion of public-private partnerships in the 4th M, the monetization industry. Through cooperation with governments and major private sector partners from the e-wallet industry, the board looks forward to establishing fruitful and innovative partnerships in order to assist online financial intermediary services from being exploited by traffickers and to effectively address the many complex facets of today's world drug problem. In addition to 19 governments, representatives from financial services organizations, online payment systems, payment service providers, cryptocurrency exchanges, and other actors in the sector also attended this meeting. We will be listening very carefully to your contribution and we will take into consideration those in the drafting of the thematic chapter of our annual report. As you know, the board's annual report reviews the global drug control situation and includes recommendations to governments and international and regional organizations. In my foreword to the INCB 2020 annual report, I recognize the important role played by NGOs and urge you to take our recommendations into account when planning your activities. We understand that you represent a broad spectrum of civil society and have a range of perspectives to offer. So we look forward to an interesting and constructive meeting today in the next 2 hours. So before giving the floor to the chair of the Vienna NGO Committee, we will, after that, listen to presentations of 5 representatives of civil society. You will each have 10 minutes to present. And after that, I hope that we will have time for an interactive discussion and questions and answers with the members of the board. Again, I would like to express the board's appreciation to the Vienna NGO Committee on Drugs for making this meeting possible and for their continued engagement with us, whether it is through the informal dialogues at the margins of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, as also recently in April this year, but also in meetings like these, or in facilitation of NGO meetings in the field during our country missions, which we hope will resume soon. Let me now invite the chair of the Vienna NGO Committee on Drugs, Mr. Jamie Bridge, to take the floor. And once again, thank you all for joining us today in this dialogue, and we look forward to a fruitful discussion. Mr. Bridge, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you so much, and hopefully you can hear me well. Dear board members, welcome to this, the third civil society hearing held by the International Narcotics Control Board. This is a relatively new and evolving mechanism here in Vienna, with previous hearings in 2018 and 2019. But the plans last year were unfortunately put on ice, as with so much else due to the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Jamie Bridge, and I'm the chair of the Vienna NGO Committee on Drugs. And we are a global network of around 400 NGOs from all around the world who our main purpose is to facilitate the engagement of civil society with the UN and with related drug policy discussions here in Vienna. So naturally, we warmly welcome these opportunities, and we thank the board for once again making space in their agenda for this dialogue with NGOs. Before I go any further, I want to congratulate you, Cornelius, on your re-election to the board, but also to welcome Mark Lunina's new role as the INCB Secretary as well. And I really look forward to continuing to work with all of you. These civil society hearings are a great opportunity for NGOs to have a dialogue and a discussion directly with the board members. And as we heard, particularly around the topics of focus for the upcoming INCB reports. And this year, that will be the topic of illicit financial flows. So the Vienna NGO Committee selected the speakers today through an open online call. And that's how we always select speakers for events like this, in order to be as inclusive as possible. So I'm delighted that we have speakers today from various different regions and who will bring various different perspectives to the meeting. The session is being recorded so that it can be watched by other civil society colleagues, particularly those in other time zones. And the video and the presentations will also be available on the Vienna NGO Committee website. So thanks again to INCB and to the INCB Secretariat for enabling this. These hearings are just one part of INCB's increasing commitment to and increasing support for civil society engagement. NGOs are regularly contacted now during the board's country visits, and we also look forward to those starting up again soon. And in December 2019, the INCB also released its first position paper on the role of civil society, which was very much appreciated by all of us. So we look forward to this relationship continuing to grow, and I really hope that today's session is helpful and informative, both for the NGOs, but also for you as board members, of course. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bridge, for your opening words as well. And let me then invite our first speaker, who is Mr. Ahmed Musa Umar from the Society for Drug Abuse Enlightenment and Control, the Zodiac from Nigeria. Mr. Musa Umar, are you there? You have the floor, sir. It seems that Mr. Umar is not yet online. So could I then invite Mr. Collins, who I do see is online, if you, from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime here in Austria, if you can take the floor, Mr. Collins.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay,
Welcome. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. I just hope my screen sharing will allow. No,
there may be a bit of an echo in the line.
Right, it won't. Ah, there we go. Okay, so they're going to share on my behalf. Is that right? Perfect. Okay. Well, look, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. It's a pleasure, and thank you to the INCB board members, to the Secretariat, and thank you also to VNGOC. It is a real pleasure to be part of these discussions, and we as an organisation really do feel that these are very important discussions to be having, as I'm going to outline. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So just to say very quickly about the organisation I work for, we are the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. We see ourselves as a network to counter networks, and it's based on the idea that promoting greater debate and innovation in approaches are really the building blocks to building a more inclusive global strategy against organised crime. So we think working with NGOs, working with civil society, working with international organizations is a key part of what we do in trying to foster better approaches to tackling organized crime as a global issue. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is one of the overarching frameworks which I think we're all here dealing with, which is under the Sustainable Development Goals, and that is under Target 16.4. Member states have pledged to significantly reduce illicit financial and arms flows, strengthen the recovery and return of stolen assets, and combat all forms of organized crime by 2030. So to substantially impact that, or to really make a difference on this, we haven't got a huge amount of time left to meet that goal. But I think it's very encouraging to see the INCB putting this as such an issue so far front and center. Okay, next slide, please. So just to quickly think about this issue of defining IFF, so I've included a UN definition there, or an explanation about what IFFs are. And if I could just add an explanation from my own organization's perspective, we see IFFs as the lifeblood of crime and corruption. They facilitate the dominance of corrupt elites, they maintain dominant power structures across geographies, and they're perhaps the most significant obstacle to achieving equality, fairness, and opportunity in transitioning economies. So this is not an important factor in mitigating or managing or tackling organized crime and illicit economies. This is one of the key factors that we face. As this distinguished group would know, the term IFFs is a relatively recent one. It was promulgated by Global Financial Integrity, which is a civil society organization, and they brought a very unique analytical framework to the table, which was using trade mispricing estimates by the IMF to work out what the leakages of legitimate trade from developing countries were, and they concluded that this was more substantial than what these countries were achieving in actual development aid. So this is a massive issue of macroeconomic significance, of governance significance, of just general security and development significance. Okay, next slide, please. Since the GFI's first report, we've seen the term IFFs has become eagerly adopted, particularly by developing economies. And partly this is the sense that they use this to highlight to international financial centers that they have to absorb some of the burden in tackling this issue, that they have responsibility for overseeing how resources are diverted and how value is diverted. And it's very much now embedded in the development lexicon. So within a decade, we've seen this become a rallying cry and a catch-all approach to thinking about issues like tax justice, illicit trade, fraud, money laundering, corruption, organized crime, all of these issues. And by the GFI's own metrics, they would suggest that IFFs averaged about 4% of world GDP over a 20-year period. So we're talking an absolutely, I don't use the word lightly, but it's an astronomically large figure, right? We're talking somewhere between 620 and $1 trillion in 2014 alone was transferred out of developing countries. And then there's an estimate that 8 to 30% of global GDP is held within tax havens, right? So there's a huge distributional, a huge equity issue here. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just very quickly on the methodology that we use within GI. So we assess both the underlying crimes and the predicate crimes of IFFs, such as tax crimes, illegal markets, extortion, corruption. But also we assess the channels through which they flow, so financial system, trade, and cash. And we argue that the benefits of this dual approach is that it represents two distinct and independent sources on IFFs. And so the diagram just kind of outlines how that works. Okay, next slide, please. The most recent UN conceptual framework on this makes less of the channel analysis, and they focus solely on, or largely on, the predicate crimes that make up IFFs. But we think it's important to focus on these three channels, the financial system, the trade system, and the cash system, because we think those are the mechanisms which enable a transfer of value through IFFs. And we think it is an important lens. And to acknowledge there is a risk or a downside to our approach is that there is a risk of double counting. But we would suggest that this is throughout the issue of IFFs, that there's myriad ways and opportunities for duplication of reporting on a single illicit financial flow. So we maintain that approach. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and that's just a graphical representation of how we think of it. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. And this is from a UN ODC UNCTAD report, just highlighting how we categorize activities that may generate illicit financial flows. Okay. Apologies, I was just going to flick through these quickly, but it's a bit slower when I'm asking someone to do it. And that's the same. That's just about the categorization. So we can jump that slide as well, please. Okay, so that's our big picture outline. I'm going to focus now a little bit more on a specific case study, which is the Western Balkans, because we have a report coming out on this relatively soon. So this is a preliminary review of some of the findings of that report. But this is particularly, I think, pertinent for this issue, which is around illicit drug trafficking. Right after the fall of Yugoslavia, we saw the emergence of this Balkans route for drugs, particularly heroin, also huge spillovers for human trafficking and migrant smuggling as well. But there's plenty of examples of how this intersection between illicit trades and financial markets and illicit financial flows within these countries. So if we look at Montenegro, very heavily reliant on industry and tourism, and it has actually seen a decrease in criminal offences over recent years, but there's been no significant reduction in financial offences in the economy, which actually 20% of their economy is now a shadow economy. But if we look at just figures which I believe are well known to this group, the Balkans route, 60 to 65 tons of heroin flow through southeastern Europe every year, worth up to €1 billion. 1 kilogram of heroin is worth twice in the Western Balkans as it is in Turkey, and doubles again in value by the time it reaches the EU. So this has huge implications for money flowing back and forth between the regions. And then cannabis is also particularly important. Okay, we can jump ahead. Okay, that's just figures highlighting the relative scale of the illicit drug trade in the region. We can jump to the next one. Okay, so let's focus on these channels that I was speaking of earlier. So firstly, the financial sector. And this includes issues such as real estate and more broadly money laundering. But this is the process by which proceeds of crime are entered into the legitimate financial system, and also how they are disguised from their origin. So banks, exchange offices, insurance brokers, investment companies, microcredit institutions, real estate firms, these are all part of the process which enables the money laundering to occur. And if we just look at the scale of money laundering, right? If we look at Bosnia and Herzegovina, between $500 million and $1 billion a year. Montenegro 1 to 300 million a year in euro, and then Serbia 1 to 2.5 billion a year in 2020 alone. So massive impact on these economies and a massive source of finance and revenue for illicit actors. Okay, next slide. And then if we look at trade-based money laundering, as the president of the Financial Action Task Force commented, one criminal network was estimated to move 400 million euro over several years through trade-based money laundering. And the FATF defines this as deliberate movement of illicit proceeds through the exploitation of trade transactions. So there's a number of ways they can do this: under-invoicing the value of goods, or over-invoicing, under-invoicing the quantity of goods, multiple invoices for the same goods, or a false description of goods. For example, low-quality items masquerading as expensive ones. And we see that in the art sector, which we're working on at the moment, quite a lot, where works of art are inflated in value and used as a means to transfer wealth. And I highlight some examples. And if we look at, say, for example, the auto parts and vehicle industry, if we look at local economies, so there's been some really remarkable research done in Brazil in recent years, anthropological research highlighting the interconnectedness between the stolen car market in Brazil and the illicit drug market, and how the stolen car market effectively serves as a mechanism to wash illicit drug money into the mainstream of the Brazilian economy. And as one legal advisor has suggested, this issue, it's like trying to find a yellow needle in a haystack. It's incredibly difficult to prove and to find evidence of it. Okay, next slide, please. And the last one is cash smuggling. So when we're looking at a situation where 20% of all workers in Serbia, 30% of all workers in Bosnia and Herzegovina are informally employed and receive cash salaries, this is a significant problem in terms of reporting and monitoring cash flows. Simply, a lot of the cash flows across borders driven in cars, in tour buses, trucks, hidden among other goods. Some is intercepted at airports and seaports, but it's so easy to cross land that people tend to choose that way. The majority of smuggling is in euro in the Western Balkans, but there's also large numbers of US dollars, Swiss francs, and British pounds. And so cash plays an important role in daily transactions. We know that, both licit and illicit. We may see it begin to lose primacy because of the expansion of the financial sector and the financial system. And also potentially because cryptocurrencies, although I think that's a more complicated issue, although anyone watching what's happened to Bitcoin in the last week, that has its own volatility and issues attached to it. But these are certainly factors that we need to take into account. Okay, next slide, please. This is just very quickly, if we could flick through this, this is another one I would point to. Just maybe the next slide. So this is a report we've done on the emergence of Eastern African coastal economy as a criminal economy. So if we could flick to the next slide, please. But one of the key factors we highlight, if you look at the fourth box from the right, or the second from the right, one of the key facilitating factors we've seen from the emergence or the rise of organized crime in the Eastern Africa seaboard is the globalization of money laundering. Right, this is a key facilitating factor for these illicit economies and enabling these kind of activities and development. So we cannot extricate the illicit IFFs from the broader development of illicit economies. They go hand in hand. Okay. Apologies if I'm running a little long. I'll try run through my implications as quickly as possible. As the president very correctly highlighted, there is a significant equity issue here. We have a war on drugs for some and not for others. We see egregious case of corporate participation in illicit drugs trades through enabling money laundering, which is let off with a slap on the wrist or a fine, which is effectively a cost of doing business for these organizations. And as was said about banks in another total different issue of regulation, if you want to dissuade activity, don't fine them, you have to criminalize it, right? Because if you fine them, it's just a cost of doing business and they will happily pay it. But this shows where you have zero tolerance approaches for low-level consumers, low-level sellers, people getting significant jail sentences, and yet participants in the international illicit financial flows, which enable this activity, are allowed off with a slap on the wrist. That's a significant problem here. Addressing, and now to go more systemic, addressing IFFs requires a hard look at how the global financial and trade system now function, and this makes it a very difficult issue to resolve. We've seen the emergence over the past few decades of a global financial system and practices around that, which have siphoned off large chunks of wealth and provide places where it can be stored with limited or no transparency. So we have a systemic issue here that we're trying to tackle, and certainly the tide is flowing against us. As one of my colleagues would say, it is almost impossible now to monitor vast swathes of global trade or to disentangle sources of funds in any systemic way. It has just become too complicated. We've seen new terms emerge, so the idea of state capture, which describes where business and criminal actors are able to actually capture parts of the workings of the state. And that is surely enabled by by IFFs and the facilitating role that they play. And then there's also, we would argue that it has to be understood that the Financial Action Task Force approach, which has been designed 3 decades ago, has frankly failed to keep pace with the way the financial system and the trade system has evolved. It's undermined by an overly bureaucratic approach, and it cannot calibrate to the complexity of the system now. Okay, the final or second last slide. Thank you. The growth of tax havens. These are reducing the oversight that we have on trade and financial transactions. We cannot tell the source and the ownership of the funds. So we would argue there's a need for transparent corporate registers and beneficial ownership registers as a critical foundation of a transparent financial system. The rise of cryptocurrencies are further obscuring the financial system. And what I would also say is, as somebody who believes cryptocurrencies to be effectively a mass Ponzi scheme, the early adopters in a Ponzi scheme are the ones who benefit. And the early adopters for many cryptocurrencies were illicit actors, right? They saw this as a means to wash cash and to store value. So what we're seeing as these Ponzi schemes continue, and forgive me, and I hope I don't get hate mail from all the Bitcoin fans out there, but what we've effectively seen is a massive transfer of wealth from new adopters within these currencies to some of the initial adopters. And that has inflated the assets and the value of illicit actors. Presumably, we could assume that has inflated the value and assets of illicit actors quite significantly. And I think we need to think about that when we think about the equity and we think about the normative value of these currencies and what effectively it's doing. I'd suggest anyone have a look at Charlie Munger's comments on this, who's he's second in command to Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway, who basically called it, I think, disgusting or against civilization. And I think this is important for us to examine on these issues. We shouldn't just accept that cryptocurrency is a legitimate or suitable tool for managing finance going forward. And last points, at GI, we always call for a more political economy focused approach to illicit flows, and thinking more holistically about the entire illicit finance supply and value chain, and identifying not so much scale, not focusing. If we were to think of the global financial integrity approach, they would focus on issues of scale and how to minimize outflows from developing countries. We take a much more harm-focused approach. We think about trying to prioritize interventions and picking points of interventions based on harm rather than just on scale. So I would leave it there. I think my last slide is just a thank you. Yes, but thank you very much. I'm really, really delighted to be part of this discussion. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Collins, for a fantastic overview, very informative and both alarming and somewhat depressing, I would say. But I'm sure that there will be discussion around the points that you've raised. Thank you very much. We'll now move to our second speaker. Could I just ask, is Mr. Moussa Oumar? He's not online yet, or he may not be able to get online. So then, could I check if Ms. Vicky Hansen is online? Yes, she is online. Ms. Hansen, could I, from the Interdisciplinary Center for Cannabis Research, the ICCR in Jamaica. Ms. Hansen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Hope I'm being heard. I'd like to thank the INCB and Vienna NGOC for just allowing me to do this very short presentation from a Caribbean perspective. Working in the Caribbean and looking at the illicit flows through drug trafficking is important, and it has been a challenge for us here. But I'd like to zero in on our experience with cannabis in its previous standing as a fully illicit plant, and now our move to a medicinal cannabis framework within the region. So the Caribbean region is no stranger to illicit drug trafficking environment, especially where it concerned the illicit trafficking of cannabis, and to us it's known as ganja. Since as early as the 1913, colonial governments within the Caribbean, especially Jamaica, had made cannabis illegal. However, this did not deter the illicit cultivation and consumption of the plant for both cultural and traditional reasons. However, and this led to the very vibrant development of an illicit cannabis industry, fueled by funds obtained from trafficking cannabis and other illicit substances to the North America and Europe. This illicit flow not only fueled the trade in illicit cannabis, but also fueled other illegal activities, such as our guns for drug trade within the region. However, in 2015, there has been a shift in the Caribbean to a more formal, legal, medicinal framework for cannabis. But this has been seeking to really disapportion small traditional growers who have been hit with very strenuous rules and licensing fees for entering the industry. Communities such as our Rastafarian communities and our Maroon communities in countries such as St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Jamaica have found it difficult to fall in line with these new regulations and fees. And so the challenge is now that illicit flows will now flow into the legal stream, because they will now need to seek funding for the requirement, the fencing, the fees, and all the legal documentation that they will now need to make themselves relevant. Because of this, and because also of the lack of willingness of the official financial institutions to support and provide services to these small farmers who will seek to legitimize themselves and their communities, they are now looking, and persons have been looking at other avenues of financial flows. And this is problematic, as it can lead a number of persons to remain in the illicit drug trade, which we do not want, or to seek funding from the illicit financial stream to do business in the legal stream. We have to remember also, and the previous speaker mentioned this, that heavy cash flows within the industry leaves ways for this to happen easily. So we're asking that the UN and look at its conventions and the banking correspondence rules that oftentimes prevent small traditional growers from entering legitimately in the business space and for seeking funding legitimately. Another challenge, and we recently saw this with our environmental conditions, the eruption of the Le Soufriere volcano in St. Vincent and the Grenadines has displaced many small traditional growers who have now had to seek new access to land because they were in the red or the orange zones. And this has brought to the fore the need for financing these communities for seeking access to allow them to move. What we have found, and even efforts from traditional NGO groups and groups such as the Fair Trade Working Group in the Caribbean that works on cannabis, we have found it extremely difficult to find legitimate sources of funding and for getting monies to these small traditional groups to help them to sustain their livelihood. Again, this opens up an avenue for the illicit flow of funds from illicit activities such as the guns for drugs and other drug trafficking activities to come into a legal stream and to facilitate the money laundering. So we are asking and we are recommending that we not only look at a medicinal framework and the regulatory framework in and of itself, but we also look about the ways in which small business operators, small cultivators, such as those in Jamaica and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, can be supported from our legal financial streams, thereby removing any temptation and any drive for members of these communities to seek alternative funding for investing in their business, especially if we want an inclusive business model. And more so, if we want to achieve our goal 11 of obtaining sustainable cities and communities, there must be a recognition to financially safeguard the cultural and the natural heritage of these communities by providing them with legal financial streams, or else we will not achieve our goal of sustainable communities and cities, because we will leave these communities and cities vulnerable to illicit drug trafficking financing. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hansen, for sharing that experience and your concerns on that as well. Let me then move to the International Association for Hospice and Palliative Care, and from the US. We were going to have Dr. Catherine Pettis, but I understand that she's unable to join us. So I understand that Ms. Eloisa Brogiato from the IAHPC will read out her statement. Ms. Brogiato, are you there? I see you. You have the floor.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you for giving the International Association for Hospice and Palliative Care the opportunity to participate in the civil society hearing. We are commenting in our capacity as an NGO in consultative status with the UN Economic and Social Council and a non-state actor in official relations with the World Health Organization. We understand the term illicit financial flows as referring to illegally earned money that is transferred or used across borders. This statement specifically discusses how the IFFS generated in the black and gray markets for illicit drugs affect access to international controlled medicines for palliative care. The lack of adequate access undermines development and security. The drug control machinery that governs access to those essential medicines was set up in the mid-20th century. Decades before the development of palliative care as a medical specialty. One of its objectives is to regulate both licit and illicit financial flows generated by narcotic drugs to ensure that only licensed growers, pharmaceutical companies, health centers, medical professionals, and revenue authorities benefit from the income generated by these medications. National drug enforcement authorities have spent billions of dollars of public funds on supply control efforts to ensure this increasingly elusive outcome. Lack of access to essential controlled medicines for the treatment of severe pain and other medical conditions has been identified as one of the factors leading to diversion and IFF. Over 70% of the global population does not have access to essential medicines needed for pain relief and palliative care. When such conditions occur, patients may seek relief by acquiring substances that have been diverted or manufactured illicitly. For decades, the INCB has traced the origins of lack of global access to unduly restrictive laws and regulations, fear of addiction, and more recently, to the lack of appropriately trained health workforces. This can be remedied by workforce training and examinable undergraduate courses of pain management. Palliative care professionals with experience in the field report little or no diversion from their clinics. We respectfully remind the INCB that global seizures of morphine were down 50% in 2020. There is no need for the INCB to update its 1995 assessment that the international system prevent diversion of narcotic drugs is working well. The number of incidents involving diversion of narcotic drugs is small, considering the large number of transactions at the international and national level. More granular research and widespread promotion of that assessment would support member states wishing to follow the recommendations in Chapter 2 of the UNGAS outcome document. This would allow them to replace security-based oversight of health needs for controlled medicines with evidence-based regulatory frameworks built around the principle of balance. Reports of palliative care teams being unable to reach patients for routine and emergency visits when narcotics enforcement operations are underway in certain neighborhoods are common. Ambulances cannot visit high crime areas after dark to take medications or services to patients in need without police escorts, if at all. Public health centers in another member state we have studied report that essential medicines disappear from government warehouses and reappear at private hospital pharmacies at much higher prices. Ministry of Health Research revealed that this was a complex operation involving highly placed actors. To reduce the opportunity costs of illicit financial flows and increase public funding to ensure availability, the IAHPC recommends that member states review and revise drug policies and regulatory frameworks to ensure that they are balanced, that they provide adequate access to affordable essential medicines while preventing any diversion that would produce illicit financial flows and associated harms. This calls for strengthening national and regional supply chains by developing local manufacturing capacity, joint procurement strategies for generic products, and workforce training on appropriate handling and prescribing of controlled medicines. These strategies support sustainable development and security. Financial action task forces address similar governance issues by supporting partner low and middle income countries to strengthen their legislative frameworks in line with international standards. Such initiatives could also help member states and regions with weak health systems and supply chains to reduce the incentive for patients and families to secure controlled medicines in the black and gray markets, an incentive that contributes to illicit financial flows and undermines security in small but often deadly ways. The IAHBC values its good collaboration and communication with the INCB. We are happy to continue enabling productive relations and innovative approaches to ensure adequate access to essential palliative care medicines for all who need them. I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brogiato, for offering another perspective on this, and particularly the direct link with patients and healthcare services. Thank you very much for that. We now move to the next speaker, who is Mr. Jorge Herrera Valderrabano from the Instituto RIA in Mexico. Mr. Herrera, you have the floor.
Hello, Chair. Thank you very much. I want to thank the INCB for organizing this hearing, and to the VNGOC for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Jorge Herrera. I am 26 years old. I am the co-founder of Instituto RIA. I'm living in Mexico City. We are an organization undertaking research to highlight innovations in public policies within a social justice and a peace-building framework. Drug policies remain at the center of our analysis. Today, I am going to speak about financial flows within drug policies and the sharp differences between financial streams within the prohibitionist regime and financial schemes in the regulation of drug markets, mainly focusing on the situation of Latin America, specifically Mexico and Colombia. So can we initiate with the thank you? So basically, we are currently living in a prohibitionist regime regarding drugs, where there is a whole international aid topic to fight drug trafficking, which then is used to buy arms, equipment, technical capacity, mainly from the United States. These are goods that are then commercialized in the legal market through illicit financial flows. The kingpin strategy, which is a failed strategy focusing too much efforts in prosecuting leaders of criminal organization, a strategy that is actually using violence as a means of asserting power, resulting in fractured organized criminal groups with little structure, but a large base of social support. Poverty facilitates the capacity to recruit for both organized criminal groups and the military bodies. The official narrative creates a public enemy in the hegemonic narrative, the other, which can range from people who use drugs to actually anyone associated with the illegal market. And private corporations fund paramilitary groups in order to deteriorate the rule of law, to displace communities, to have free rein for exploration for opportunities such as mining or other extractive industries. Next, please. Thank you. So under the prohibitionist regime, well, we haven't seen a significant impact in the reduction of production or consumption of drugs. And this is why we need to acknowledge that a world with drugs is a reality, but also that peace is possible. Cultivating communities are currently stuck. They get paid low prices from organized criminal groups. They take risks to find better social opportunities, or they have their crops eradicated. Countries orchestrate harmful operations to fumigate or manually eradicate crops. In Mexico, we just acknowledged the harmful effects of glyphosate for communities, and we just started a gradual elimination of its use, but this is not the case of Colombia, where the discussion of the use of glyphosate is unfortunately being retaken. We have also seen the enlargement of the economic power of organized criminal groups, and these revenues are being spent in other areas. Less than 1% of the revenues in drug commercialization do not remain in countries of origin. In the case of cocaine, for example, Colombia, whereas 65% remain with retailers in countries of consumption, for example. So that makes us think, whose interests are we really serving with drug prohibition? And a neoliberal capitalist model is favored within this regime for numerous reasons, including limiting access to substances that alter perceptions about the role of humans on the planet, and consequently less people questioning the economic status quo. Next slide, please. So under a prohibitionist regime, the illegal drug market fuel illicit financial flows, primarily to corrupt government activities in order to create benefits to criminal groups. Illicit financial flows abound in illegal drug markets, fractioning public institutions. In Colombia, public and private research institutions suggest that the market economy behind the production and commercialization of coca leaf and cocaine contribute to around 2% or more to Colombia's GDP, which is increasing yearly. Illicit money is transferred to benefit criminal actors with impunity. Judges in the judicial power are being bribed to avoid criminal sanctions, and decision makers follow the mandates of organized criminal groups in exchange of amounts of money that go through illicit financial flows. And of course, the deep web and crypto markets facilitate the distribution of revenues from drug production and commercialization into other illegal activities. So based on this, it is evident that we have a huge urgency to look after alternatives to prohibition, and the legal regulation of drugs is setting a good route for tackling issues derived from illegal financial flows because of prohibition. Regulation of drugs means that the state takes control of the market, and the production chain is controlled by public institutions instead of by criminal organizations. And here we have a list of known topics related to the development and where drug policies have a direct impact. And the legal regulation of drug markets, such as cannabis, for example, can be an effective tool for ending poverty, fostering sustainable livelihoods by bringing economic opportunities to vulnerable criminalized groups, by accompanying their transition into legal markets, providing more sustainable livelihoods where communities can use public services available and production can be more ordered, more planned. In public health, of course, the legal access to drugs through legal regulation means privileging public health access to essential medicines, but as well as providing medical alternatives in drugs to people. The improvement on the allocation of resources to public health with a strong focus on the prevention of drug use and harm reduction strategies is key in a regulatory model aiming to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And this, of course, is a policy that may allow us to that may allow a lot of groups and populations to transit to a formal economy. Repression and criminalization actions characteristic of prohibition hinder the correct functioning of institutions and pose a threat to governance and to the rule of law, considering the influence of the revenues of criminal organizations in decision making. So yeah, these are some of other topics that are related to drug policy and the Sustainable Development Goals, and that can be achieved through legal regulation. So next, please, next slide. And the thing is that when we speak about public policies, we speak about policies within a social justice framework, and we have identified at least 4 principles of this approach. We believe, or we recognize, that a public policy that is within a social justice framework towards development is one that actively confronts the dynamics of privilege and oppression, that recognize the existence of groups that have been historically and currently marginalized, and that generate affirmative and retributive actions to balance the levels of justice, designated resources towards reparations. And the legal regulation of drug markets is a public policy that must be framed within a social justice framework. Next, please. Next slide. And this is something that we've been proposing for the Mexican model for the regulation of cannabis markets for personal use. We have a law on medical cannabis since 2017 that just came into effect because the secondary normativity was just published this year. But here we are speaking about cannabis for personal or adult use. The Supreme Court of Justice recognized in Mexico that prohibition of cannabis is unconstitutional for impeding the right to the free development of personality since 2018. The regulation framework proposed and currently being discussed in Congress established different channels for access, for nonprofit purposes and for commercialization purposes, and also considers mechanisms to prevent minors from accessing as well as social opportunities at all levels. Some public research institutions in Mexico estimate that cannabis regulation can take from 14% to 25% of the revenues from illegal groups. Uruguay mentioned in its last report on the status of cannabis regulations to have covered almost 80% of the illegal market with regulation. And Canada has made similar claims about a 50% coverage on the market. So yeah, this is a public policy that can be used to promote economic opportunities to formerly criminalized populations, to recognize human rights, and to improve access to public services. And the law that is being currently discussed at the Congress in Mexico must consider reparations on the harms related to punitive policies on drugs and may provide opportunities to cultivating communities. We are trying this by specifying a minimal percentage or number of licenses that must be given to vulnerable communities in rural contexts that have lived violence because of drug control strategies. This will inevitably build more trust in institutions, ergo reduce violence mainly from public security elements towards vulnerable populations. it increases the tax collection, not only because of cannabis commercialization, but because communities now do not have reasons to be in the informal sector, in the many economic activities they perform, and see many benefits from transition into a legal and formal scheme. Legal regulation can also lead to a better public spending and a more efficient allocation of resources, as it has happened in the states of the United States that have regulated cannabis for personal use and are using the resulting money to improve their healthcare system, to build schools, to improve their programs. Next slide, please. In Mexico, we need a law that privileges social justice and vulnerable populations instead of an extractivist regulation model, similar to what happened with medical cannabis in Colombia. Colombia issued a regulation that focused too much on foreign investment and exportation, with minimal clauses for small and medium cultivators, implementing more of a pharmaceutical model. Medical cannabis cultivation and transformation is a reality since 2016. However, the market has been dominated by foreign investment instead of fostering community-level entrepreneurship. And while we are also currently seeing the first legislation in Congress to regulate the coca leaf and cocaine market in Colombia, it is an initiative that respects traditional uses, mainly a model privileging a state monopoly on the commercialization of coca leaf. And well, the model considers a state company that would buy the production from approved communities and then sell it for transformation to other actors. And we like this model because it allows the state to deliver higher social outcomes and procure a fair wage and the well-being of communities. Peace building, gender, environmental rights is central to this legislation. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I would only like to do a collective exercise in which we can think about the question, how can we use drug policy to invest public revenue more strategically? No? And here we have two scenarios. So prohibition characterizes for a lack of transparency in the global financial system, tax evasion, and an informal economy as a whole. So there are many incentives and reasons for not paying taxes, are more than the benefits for staying in a formal economy within this scenario of a prohibitionist regime. Public spending focuses on repression, vigilance, and law enforcement, leading to mass incarceration and distraction of security elements from prosecuting violent activities. So in a regulation scenario, in a scenario where we have a legal regulation of drug markets, we can think about increasing financial channels with population in informal economies from both public and private institutions. We can expect healthier institutions and a better rule of law, increase public spending, but more intelligently, focusing on health, no? On education, on the needs of communities, and to focus financial resources on prosecuting crimes of high impact. So this is something that we should balance when we are considering both public policies when we are speaking about illicit financial flows. Thank you very much. In the next slide is my contact information, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Herrera, for offering yet another perspective to this. And it has clearly been a very interesting and a very rich discussion. I get the message that our last speaker, Mr. Moussa Oumar, has not been able to connect, unfortunately. Although I do see a name who seems to be like him, or... So it seems that Mr. Moussa Oumar from the Society for Drug Abuse, Enlightenment and Control from Nigeria. Are you there, sir? May we give you the floor for your statement?
All right. I'm sorry for the late to join the conference. I had a very terrible login issues, but I'm sorry for that. First of all, I would like to appreciate the opportunity given to me to participate in this important conference, and we are highly grateful for the opportunity. Briefly, because of the time constraint, I would like to focus the discussion on the illicit financial flow through drug trafficking, examine its impact on development and security, making my country, Nigeria, which is ranked as the third most terrorized country in the world, according to the Global Terrorism Index. Nigeria, according to the International Narcotic Control Board, Nigeria has been the most, the transit has been one of the transit of illicit drugs, and a lot of arrests that were made in the Europe. You see, almost 50% of those arrestees are Nigerians. This is a really an alarming issue that we are not taking it lightly. Nigeria is being ravaged by a number of insecurity, aspect of insecurity, such as the Boko Haram, the armed banditry, the kidnapping, and the rest. And we have evidence to show that almost all of these crimes are being promoted by the drug cartel. For instance, now, Nigeria, as I said, since 2009, the Boko Haram insurgency has cost the life of over 36,000 Nigerians, and it has displaced over 2.4 million people, both within the country and some who, outside the country as displaced persons. And all these are as a result of the insurgency. According to the former NDLEA chairman, almost all the camps of Boko Haram overrun by the security operatives. They found hard drugs. This will show you that these insurgents, they are using the hard drugs to perpetuate the crimes, as we are seeing now in Nigeria. And so also, now in this country, Nigeria, the kidnappers, I know it's not a hidden thing that Nigeria is really suffering from the kidnapping incident. You see a lot of, especially in the northern region, a lot of school children are afraid because of the incessant kidnapping. Now, the kidnappers, part of the ransom they negotiate, apart from the monetary ransom, they also negotiate for exchange of the victims with hard drugs, apart from the monetary terms. So this is an alarming issue. So also, um, we are also witnessing the issue of farmers herders clashes. These clashes are also promoted by drug, drug trafficking, because a lot of reports by for instance, the National Security Advisor to our President Muhammadu Buhari. A meeting was called last year where the president raised alarm that the menace of drug abuse are responsible for the increase in security in the country, including armed banditry, kidnappings, and raping. So in Nigeria today, kidnapping is a recurring decimal. In recent times, the country has been witnessing kidnapping incidents among travelers from one state to the other, and most recently, kidnapping of school students. Some of these kidnappers seek supply of hard drugs as a ransom for the release of their victims during negotiations. Illicit financial flows through drug trafficking are increasingly understood as a threat to sustainable development and one of the greatest contemporary challenges to global development. They undercut economic growth and legitimate trade, depriving government of the financial resources they might otherwise invest in public goods such as health, education, and infrastructure. Successive governments, Nigerian governments, have been budgeting billions of dollars to purchase arms and ammunition to fight the different aspects of insecurity threatening the peace and existence of the country. I would like to mention some of the channels of drug trafficking in Nigeria. Mostly smuggled drugs are brought into the country and outside the country through the porous border. Nigeria actually is having a problem of porous border because we have a number of countries that are surrounding us, which is giving the government very tough tax to man the borders. So also through the internet and also through the air route. Recently, with the appointment of the current chairman of the National Drug Law Enforcement Agency, the country witnessed crackdowns, unprecedented arrests of drug cartels and drugs worth billions of naira. So at this point, because of the time limitation, I would like to highlight some of the factors that encourage our youth to traffic drugs. One, we have the financial burden. Some of these youths or the people generally who are into this business, you find that they have a number of issues to take care of because of lack of job employment. You see, these youth are being pushed into drug trafficking. So also youth unemployment, also the desire to get rich quickly, peer group pressure, addiction, sexual involvement, break up relationship. Some of some of the issues that are pushing our youth into drug trafficking, and the cartels are using that opportunity to recruit them and also to give away for the insurgents to have access to these hard drugs. At the next point, I would like to highlight what our organization, Society for Drug Abuse, Enlightenment and Control, has been doing in the last 8 years to help the government overcome some of these challenges. For instance, the organization has developed the first technological tool which we use to track the routes of drug traffickers and also the transactions. This technology, we first presented it to the current National Drug Law Enforcement Agency chairman, which he highly applauded the effort of the organization to deploy this technology for the first time in the country to help in fighting drug abuse. Also, the organization deemed it necessary to push for amendment to some of the laws, regulating drugs in Nigeria. In this regard, this organization is engaging the various committees of the National Assembly, both the upper and the lower chambers, with the view to amending the laws for it to reflect the current reality and also to help in tackling the menace of drug abuse. Thirdly, this organization is working with the agency responsible for fighting drug abuse, that is the NDLEA, National Drug Law Enforcement Agency, and the organization is acting as a whistleblower to track the root of illicit drugs and their transactions. The trustees of this organization have also instituted a legal action against some of the pharmaceutical industries who were exposed as transacting and selling drugs into the black market. We are currently in court with them, and I know some of us will remember that there was a documentary released in 2018 by the BBC Africa Eye, which exposed some of these pharmaceutical industries. We waited for almost 3 years. The government have not done anything. So we deem it necessary to file a legal action. We are at the Federal High Court, the Federal Capital Territory. Now, briefly, I would like to discuss some of the recommended strategies of preventing illicit drug trafficking in Nigeria. One, reduction of target markets. These target markets, as I said earlier, we have identified some of them, and we are working with the government for the government to deploy the necessary resources and the personnel to track down on these markets. Secondly, adequate funding and training of security operatives. There must be adequate funding, because like Nigeria now is also one of the countries that are producing methamphetamine. We have, according to the NODC, almost 11 laboratories, where this meth is being produced, but lack of resources is impeding the effort of the government and the operatives to even locate these areas. So also orientation and education of the youth. This will help, and our outreach program is what we have been doing to orient the youth so as to prevent them from getting into this nasty business. Also, we recommend the use of full body scanning machines, because our borders, our land, transport means, and also through the air, using a full body scanning machine will also help in detecting some of these drugs. So also strong law and good governance, because lack of good governance will make people desperate, and it will make them to go into drugs. So also we recommend constant monitoring and technology in blogs and websites, because you can see in Nigeria, youth are so into this technology, and they are using it to perpetrate a lot of crime. So monitoring using the technology to monitor the activities will also help. Second to the last is adequate intelligence gathering on drug trafficking. This will help in curtailing this menace. So also the need for effective air monitoring, because some of these drugs are brought into the country and they are also taken out of the country through the means of air transportation. So these are some of the recommendations. We really have a lot to say, but due to the time limitation, this is the little of what we can say. But we are sure that our paper will inform the members on the more to be done and the current situation of drugs in Nigeria. Thank you very much for the opportunity given to us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Umar, for being with us, and good that you managed to get connected, and thank you for sharing the the perspective from Nigeria in terms of the problems, but also what you're doing and recommending to do to remedy this. That brings us to the end of the presentations. So at this point, the floor is open for board members, but also for the NGO for any further points or questions that you would like to raise with regard to the presentations or more general comments around it. So the floor is open. I give the floor to Ambassador Johnson, member of the board.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank all of the representatives of the NGO community who have gathered with us today and have taken the time to craft presentations for us to hear. We're grateful that you've spent this time with us, and we're even more grateful that you've helped us understand your perspective on the issues that we deal with, and you do as well. One of the things that we work with here is that the board works within the constraints of the conventions and what it is charged to do. We're not charged to come up with a good drug strategy in our sole and uncontrolled discretion. And the focus of the conventions is on how the board works with the states parties. With that in mind, I've got a question for the gentleman who made the presentation for the global initiative, although others may wish to respond as well. As I listened to your presentation, there were a number of ideas and initiatives that or programs that you and your colleagues were recommending that governments take. But if there is kind of not looking for a silver bullet here because none exist, but if there is a single or one or two steps that governments might take with the encouragement of the board, which you believe would have a significant impact, that would be useful if you could help us with that focus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Johnson. And as I will leave Mr. Collins to think a moment about the question, and perhaps others as well, because it's of course a relevant, a very relevant one. Let me also ask Ms. Pavadia, also member of the board, for her intervention, and then we'll get back to the answer or the Madam Pavadia.
Mr. President, and thank you to all the speakers who have given their time and their ideas for us to listen in on the subject. Now, the topic of illicit financial flows and its impact on development and security, that is the subject of our Chapter 1, and therefore we thought it would be good to have the civil society viewpoint on this issue. Now, Mr. John Collins talked in depth about the volumes of finances which are being moved around the world due to various transnational crimes, including drug trafficking. I would like to ask him if he knows of any study which has been done on the development and security of any of the countries in the developing world where there is so much of financial movement of money due to these crimes. What I'm trying to say is there a case study on any one or two countries where this money outflow has directly brought the development and security of that country, it's compromised the development and security of that country? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Pavadia. I also see Dr. Zingella, but before I give you the floor, let me first hand back to Mr. Collins, if you can provide your perspective on these 2 points by Ambassador Johnson and Madam Pavadia. Mr. Collins?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you very much for the questions, and thank you to all the co-presenters as well. It's been a really interesting session thus far. To Ambassador Johnson's question, I would probably have two. That there's, to move away from, well, systemically, we need to address how the entire financial system is working towards siphoning off funding from developing economies, and to bring it more specific and within the mandate of INCB, I think that is how I hear the question, and I think that's particularly important here. I think this case of equity and this discussion of equity and this double standard that's held to enablers of illicit financial transactions, which are clearly around the drugs trade. And I think we all know of what example I'm talking about, where a major international bank, there has been other cases, but one particular international bank which effectively got a slap on the wrist for enabling Mexican cartels to launder money. We have to be out front and center in highlighting this, because I think we know the case and we know the arguments about how the war on drugs has been disproportionately an impact on poor and marginalized communities. And we should not have such a visible example where there is one law for the rich and the powerful, and there is one law for the poor and the marginalized. So I think that's entirely within the INCB mandate, and I think that is one area that I would be pushing for greater focus on, given the existence of the conventions. The second, I could name a few, but I think I would be focusing on cryptocurrency. I think this is absent from a lot of the public discussion on cryptocurrency about the role that this is having in facilitating a lot of these activities. And the distributional effect that these currencies have on the proceeds from illicit drug trades, and who is benefiting from it. And I think that has to be part of the international discussion and some of the regulatory discussions around cryptocurrencies. And this is an embryonic discussion. I know in the US, the SEC and others are only starting to grapple with how to deal with some of these currencies and some of the illicit dimensions around them. But that's certainly, I think, INCB could be front and center in highlighting. To the point about, is there case studies around this? Yes, absolutely. And I pointed to the Balkans, reports which we will be releasing soon, and that is an attempt to have a comprehensive look at the Western Balkans from a case of illicit financial flows. It's not a case of it's threatening the integrity of the states, although it has massive development and security implications there. We have also done a number of reports I highlighted the one on the East Africa coastline. You could think of the case of Guinea-Bissau. You could think of others. Guinea-Bissau is obviously a particularly extreme example, but I think a lot of these are facilitated and certainly enabled by the existence of illicit financial flows. So I don't think you have to look very far and hard for cases of state capture or governance collapses within states and the relationship between illicit financial flows. I think the two are very well interconnected. So I hope that begins, and I'm certainly happy to provide, rather than list off reports now, I'm certainly happy to provide more materials as may be useful afterwards via email.
Thank you very much, Mr. Collins. Dr. Zingela, also member of the board.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you again to all our presenters for really engaging and informative presentations. My first question goes to Ms. Hansen, and it's about the point that was made regarding the fact that there are a number of small-scale farmers within the Caribbean who are excluded from illicit trade with cannabis. And I'm wondering if the governments of these Caribbean countries have actually started engaging with banks about potential funding which could be linked to tax breaks. And I'm asking that question because of the effect that Ms. Hansen highlighted on keeping these small-scale farmers continuing with the illicit trade because of lack of funding. So that is my one question. And then the second one is, I suppose, referring to Dr. John Collins' presentation, which I also found very engaging, and specifically if one looks at the concept of state capture. If we look at what's happening in my back home, for example, in South Africa, at the moment we have a commission that is looking at the effect of state capture and illicit financial flows, which have really crippled our country and the running of lots of institutions within South Africa. As a result, we've got the collapse of the national airline, we've got the collapse of the energy company, which was also nationally run. All of these companies companies were targeted by specific individuals who were busy with exactly this kind of money or illicit financial flows. And what was actually surprising to us was the involvement of so-called legitimate banks which accepted this kind of money. So I can really say that coming from South Africa, we have seen the major effects that has had, resulting in all sorts of bad economic effects on the people, and also, of course, linked to crime, which also includes the drug trade. So thank you very much for those comments.
Thank you, Dr. Zingela, for also alluding to that as an example, but very concrete. Could I give the floor to Ms. Hansen, and after that to Mr. Collins to respond to the 2 points? Ms. Hansen?
Yes, thank you for that question. Really, the truth is we have made attempts to meet with our banking sector within the Caribbean to try and resolve that issue. But as small island developing states, we are extremely dependent on financial flows and development aid. And a number of our financial institutions, even our central banks within the region, are concerned and want to stay away from cannabis because how cannabis is regulated and viewed as an illicit crop within the international space. And so no country as small as St. Vincent, Jamaica, the smaller countries, even within CARICOM, wants to take that risk because of our dependency on larger states and financial institutional relationships. We have issues such as remittances that can be challenged and will be challenged. And so the very nature, I think a presenter mentioned it earlier, the very nature of cannabis as seen as illicit prevents and brings into focus these correspondence banking rules that prevents the inclusion of these small farmers and the community. And what you have is the risk of capture by big pharmaceutical and bigger companies, leaving small farmers within an illegal space, and therefore the cycle will continue if we do not change the very framework. And I think an answer to INCB and what INCB can do is try as much to support a change in these banking regulations that are inadvertently locking out communities, small communities, and for Caribbean nations such as ours, the inclusion of these small communities, cannabis growing communities, is important for our development. And so we are asking that the consideration be given to how the rules are now being outlined if we really intend to remove illicit fund flows or we intend to really go for sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hansen. And then let me ask again, Mr. Collins, any further comments on the issue that Dr. Zingela raised and state capture?
I think just to say thank you for a very interesting and personalized comment, and I think absolutely, and I have colleagues who do a lot of work in South Africa, and Mark Shaw, Simone Haysom, who write a lot about this, and I think this highlights a case of there are the particularly visible cases where this is happening now, but I think we also have to be cognizant as well of the more subtle cases. I don't want to rehash the last 4 years in the United States, but I think there were some very visible elements of state capture occurring where certain processes were being corrupted to certain business interests. And I think we have to be aware of that and how pernicious that can be and how subtle that can be until it's not so subtle anymore. And I think South Africa is a case of where that occurs. I would also caution around, I think there's not enough discussion around the role of ESG when it comes to things like illicit trades and illicit economies. So, ethical investing is a huge, huge business now. It is a huge component of what fund managers have to look at and what international investment institutions have to look at. And we hear an awful lot about the environmental impact of certain funds and certain activities, but we hear less so about what the governance impacts are, on, particularly as they relate to illicit trades. And I think that is somewhere that INCB and others could be feeding into the discussion and sensitizing the public and investment managers more aware to. To give you an example on how complex this becomes, right? So everyone who owns a share in the S&P 500 now, probably the most substantial and famous index fund in the world, owns Bitcoin indirectly, because one of the main participants in the S&P 500, Tesla, owns Bitcoin. So if you have ethical concerns, and a lot of people do around the environmental impact, but if you have ethical concerns around the criminal and governance impacts of these currencies as well, indirectly, most people who are investing via a diversified portfolio now own in some way a currency that some people think enables criminal activity. So there's got to be, I think, a greater awareness around this and a greater sensitization of this, and that's how I think we start to tackle this. But again, just to reiterate, I think exactly that is that it's subtle until it becomes obvious, and that's what we need to be aware of. We need to be tackling the more subtle elements to prevent it becoming so enshrined and ingrained that it just becomes accepted as the reality of how a country is operating. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. Are there any other board members who want to raise issues? I'm also looking at the board members who are connected online in different parts of the world. Any one of the other board members? I don't see any hands for the time being. Yeah. Madame Pavadia?
Thank you, Mr. President. I was wanting to ask Mr. John Collins, how much of these illicit financial flows can be attributed to corruption in the system, and especially for drug-related organizations, etc. So we all know that in the structures in various governments where there is trafficking, that there is the bureaucratic setup is also corrupted, and this corruption also contributes to giving a deleterious effect on the systems in place. So and I would say that corruption is sort of overlap on all these things we've been talking about relating to illicit financial flows. So have you noticed or have you seen in any study that corruption is one of the major issues in illicit financial flows? Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Pavadia. Mr. Collins, any figures on that? Or?
Yes, so I don't have a figure. Is my camera working? Oh, sorry, I closed my screen. I don't have exact figures on this, but I think we're more in actually a conceptual question here. For initial illicit financial flows to operate, corruption is symbiotic, right? It is in many ways, not entirely, but corruption is the enabler of illicit financial flows, and vice versa. They enable corruption. So we are talking an absolutely overwhelming part of illicit financial flows are enabled by corruption. Then we can break it down into what segment of the illicit market is dominated by the drug market, how much revenue is generated by the drug market, but then that goes into other assets which can appreciate and depreciate, so it can change over time. But I think without corruption, this becomes less of an issue. And so the focus on governance and reducing corruption is one of the main ways that you can tackle IFFs, and you can start to push back on them. So I hope I haven't dodged the question. We don't have a specific figure on this, and because the two are so unclearly overlapped. But to take it to a systemic level again, this is about illicit financial flows are about people accumulating wealth and trying to move that wealth out of areas or to move it in ways that either just removes it from the location or covers where the wealth was generated, hides where the initial transactions were around generating the illicit wealth. And so that is an innately corrupt process in so many ways. And to go back to how do we tackle it? Well, there is only one real significant way to tackle a transnational issue, and that is through transnational cooperation. And that again is very difficult because we have to raise all regulatory standards, and we have to remove this incentive towards the countries that benefit are the ones that have the lowest regulations or the least transparency, and are the ones who are enabling massive amounts of these illicit flows to move through their jurisdictions. So that is to say, it's a very difficult problem, and corruption is a difficult problem, but it is one I think we nevertheless have to try grapple with. So I hope that begins to answer it.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. I see Mr. Herrera has asked for the floor.
Hello, Mr. President. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak again. Only to answer the last question. Yeah, we have seen in Mexico the involvement of criminal organizations that are being funded through illicit financial flows, mainly as a result of the commercialization of drugs, arms, and other illegal activities. It is a serious challenge, considering their involvement in electoral processes, but also in decision-making processes. The existence of illicit financial flows is also a threat to public health. We have a shortage in the access to essential medicines, mainly because of the diversion of medicines into illegal streams. And I just wanted to mention one report from the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which is this international organization comprised of former presidents and UN representatives, which is titled Enforcement of Drug Laws, Refocusing on Organized Crime Elites, which has many examples on the cases that can be studied regarding this topic, and it has several recommendations on how we can overcome issues on illicit financial flows.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the clock, and I want to slowly start wrapping up. Are there any other final points that somebody would like to make, or questions to ask here from the board? I see none. Then I would like to ask Monsieur Bernard Leroy, who is the rapporteur of the board, to have a few concluding remarks. I will then afterwards hand back to Mr. Bridge before I will close then the meeting. Monsieur Leroy, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. And thank you to all of the speakers. It would be very difficult to summarize what was said. There were so many ideas shared, and there was such a great diversity among them. However, I can't draw a few conclusions. So once again, we've had a very interesting and useful exchange. And what was very interesting was that in the diversity of approaches that are out there, the NGOs show us that they are competent and determined to get to grips with all of the aspects of the drug phenomenon as it stands in 2021. So the social aspects, the health aspects, and so forth. And what what we can say is that we need the NGOs more than ever before. Drugs is increasingly an issue that's addressed by civil society. It's something that we have forgotten in the past and that we tend to continue to forget. So we very much appreciate the quality of the exchange that we had, the involvement and commitment of the NGOs, their engagement and commitment, and we very much value their responsiveness in terms of responding to new trends, and we can say that they will be decisive in defining a new strategy to be used to address the drug problem. So the presence of NGOs across the board is of the essence, and all of that calls for us to strengthen up our cooperation with NGOs. I think it would be a good idea for us to come up with a mechanism to increase the frequency of these exchanges with NGOs, and also to see how we can ensure that their contribution is impactful in terms of what is decided within international institutions in the area of drugs. Thank you.
Merci bien. Thank you very much, Monsieur Leroy, for your comments. Could I then ask Mr. Bridge for some final comments on the session as well? Mr. Bridge?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. President. It was a great session. So thank you so much again for making this possible. Thank you to all of the NGOs who presented. I'm really glad that we managed to get everyone connected in the end. It's really good news. Really interesting. And as I've said, we will be uploading all of the statements and presentations and the recording to the Vienna NGO Committee website as soon as we can once the session has closed. So yeah, just to say thank you once again to INCB, to all the board members, but also to the Secretariat for having us today at this meeting and for continuing this commitment to engaging with civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bridge, and again, thank you to all the NGOs that have contributed to the session. Clearly, my feeling is that as the board, we have made an excellent decision to actually write our chapter 1 in this annual report on the illicit financial flows. From the presentations that you have given us, the things haven't actually become much easier, and it has become much more complex as well. But it's clear that this issue has a huge bearing and a huge influence on the capacity of states to comply with their obligations under the international conventions and to counter the problems created by illicit drug use and manufacture and trafficking. So in that respect, it is really extremely important that also as the board we put our focus on this issue. And thank you also for giving some very concrete areas where, as the board, we could advocate for countries to take action, and we can call also the attention of the international community to seriously start addressing this issue. As I indicated in my opening words, we, through our GRIS program, we have started to take also some very practical and operational steps in bringing the several partners to the table in terms of internet companies, in terms of fintech companies, e-wallet service companies, and so on, and to also make them aware of the realities that we're all facing. Over the last many years as the board, we have put in place a series of secure online platforms where also governments can interact in real time and exchange information. And in that respect, we also hope that we can make a practical contribution to start tackling this highly diverse and extremely complex but very relevant issue. So again, let me close here. Again, thanking you all for connecting, for sharing your views and your very diversity of contributions to this discussion. Of course, it's also for the NGOs. It's not the most common thing to discuss for most of them. But again, we greatly appreciate for taking the time and making your contribution, which will surely help us to further draft the Chapter 1 of our annual report next year. And we're truly committed as the board to taking this issue very seriously and to continue to work with governments, but also with all other partners to make a contribution and to tackling, again, this highly complex issue that has so much effects on the world drug situation. So let me close here. Thank you all very much for attending and for contribution, and we look forward to our continued contacts. Thank you all very much. Goodbye. For board members here, I suggest we leave it here. We start our break now. We only have 5 more minutes of interpretation, so I think we break here. And when we come back at 4 o'clock, we need to log out of this Interprefy link, and we need to log into the other link again. So thank you all very much for being here. Thank you, interpreters, and we reconvene at 4 o'clock. Thank you.